How do you get rid of slugs and snails? The internet is full of different home remedies to get rid of slugs, but which of these actually work? That is one of the key questions I'm going to answer in this video. In the second half, I'll show you some other options, including some natural ones, to reduce the number of pests in your garden. What is the difference between a slug and a snail? Biologically, they're essentially the same animal. They look different because one has this house on the back, but other than that, they are the same animal. There are over 70,000 different species, but many of these live in the ocean and in fresh water, so we're not concerned with those. But even on land, there are quite a few different species. To keep the video short, I'm going to discuss each home remedy very briefly. If you want any more information about any of these home remedies, hop on over to my blog, gardenmyths.com. I've written an article about every one of these, and in those articles I go into much more detail. In many cases I'll show you videos of the slugs and snail crawling over things. See how fast they crawl over things like coffee grounds and eggshells. I'll also show you the effect of rolling a slug in diatomaceous earth. And you can even see what happens if you spray a slug with ammonia. Let's have a look at diatomaceous earth, or DE for short. These are the skeletal remains of marine algae, and it's claimed that they're very sharp. And when slugs crawl over DE, their bellies are cut and their insides run out, and that kills the slug. Well, I've done some tests with these slugs, and I found that slugs do not want to cross diatomaceous earth. I'm not sure why, but they just don't want to touch the material, provided it's dry. Once the DE is wet, they have no problem crawling over it. What about the claim that diatomaceous earth cuts these slugs? Well, I took a slug and I rolled him in diatomaceous earth. I covered him with it. Well, in a few minutes, he had created a lot of mucus, he had sloughed off all the DE, and he crawled away happy. No slug was harmed in this test. Now, diatomaceous earth is good for killing hard-bodied insects. Some people think it's effective because it scratches them, but the real reason is that the diatomaceous earth dries up the oils that are on the outside coating of insects. And without those oils, they can't maintain their moisture levels and they dehydrate. So it is good for killing some insects, both good and bad insects, but it really doesn't do much for slugs. But when it comes to slugs, you'd have to put the DE around your plants on the soil, and the soil is moist, so the DE very quickly absorbs moisture and becomes ineffective. It's really not good for controlling slugs. What about coffee grounds? Well, this is pretty easy for you to test yourself. Get some coffee grounds and some slugs. Make a circle of coffee grounds, similar to a donut, and then put the slugs in the middle. The only way for them to escape is to crawl over the coffee grounds. They have no trouble crawling over coffee grounds. Doesn't stop them in the least. This is a complete myth. What about eggshells? Now, it's claimed that eggshells are really sharp. They cut the bodies of these slugs. But if you crush up eggshells and form that donut I just described, they have no problem crawling over them. The idea that you're going to cut slugs with something sharp doesn't make sense. Look at this picture. Slugs have no problem crawling over razor blades. Eggshells don't work at all. Now, some people claim copper works, and so they'll take either copper wire or copper tape and put it around pots where they're growing plants. This kind of works. Slugs don't like to crawl over copper, but to be honest, if they're hungry enough, they'll have no problem crossing it. Copper on its own really doesn't work in the garden. However, if you take that copper wire and attach it to a battery, in effect you're creating a little electronic fence that will keep slugs away. That may be useful in a raised bed. You could put copper wire around the whole perimeter of the bed, attach it to a battery, and slugs will stay out of that raised bed. Cornmeal and grits. The claim here is that slugs will eat this material, and it's very dry. Once it gets into their stomach, it absorbs water and expands and explodes the slug. Well, this is complete nonsense. You'll hear the same claim for ants. Ants eat cornmeal, gets in their stomach and explodes them. I don't know of any insect or small animal that can't eat cornmeal. In fact, when they prepare escargot, they take the snails and feed them on cornmeal for a little while. That purges their gut out and makes them cleaner for eating. Restaurants wouldn't do that if it killed slugs. The use of cornmeal is just feeding your slug population and making more of them. Complete nonsense. What about an ammonia spray? If you come to my blog, gardenmist.com, I have a video of what happens when you spray a slug with ammonia. It's not a pretty picture. It definitely kills them. But the recommendation I see most often is to take the ammonia and spray it on the soil or on your plants, and that keeps the slugs away. Well, that doesn't work. Ammonia is very volatile. It evaporates quickly. Within a few minutes of spraying this, it's gone. So it's not going to control slugs and snails in that way. Now, if you do want to go in the garden and go and spray the actual pest, that does work. But be careful with ammonia. Ammonia contains a lot of nitrogen, and too much nitrogen will harm your plants, in the same way that putting on too much fertilizer on your lawn will kill your lawn. I don't really recommend the use of ammonia. What about table salt? A lot of people claim that that kills slugs, and it does in a way. If you go out and find a slug and you dump some salt on top of it, it will kill the slug. The problem with table salt is that the sodium in it is also toxic to plants, and you don't want to spread it all over your garden. And taking salt and sprinkling it on the soil will not stop slugs. It's not really a good remedy either. Alright, beer traps are quite common. You take some small dish, put beer inside, take the dish and sink it in the soil so the soil level comes up to the top of the dish. Slugs love beer, and they're attracted to the traps. They come over to get a drink, fall in and drown. Well, there's a really interesting video on my website that shows what happens during the night. And there are many slugs that come for a drink. And it's true, a couple do fall in, but most of them just leave with a hangover. So beer traps do work. They will collect a few slugs, but the majority of the slugs just come for a drink and leave. Now, if you do want to use this, you don't have to waste your good beer. Simply mixing some sugar, yeast, and water will do the same thing. It's not the beer they're after. They actually want the yeast. I don't really consider this a very practical solution in a garden. So those are some home remedies, and for the most part, they really don't work very well, or they don't work at all. So what does work? Well, there are some commercial products in the market which work very well. These are called slug baits, and they contain either metaldehyde or iron phosphate. Both of these chemicals are very safe, and they're very effective at killing slugs. Now, there is some concern that they also kill other animals. It is important to keep the bait covered so that things like birds, small animals, pets, and kids don't go and eat it. But if you do that, it's a pretty safe way to control your slug problem. What about natural methods in the garden? Well, there's quite a few things you can do. The first is to understand the favorite food of slugs. They like to eat half-rotting plant material, and they prefer that over your healthy plants. The problem is that most gardeners clean their garden up too much. They remove their favorite food, and so the poor slugs have nothing left to eat except your precious plants. There are lots of natural predators for slugs. Things like toads, snakes, and frogs all eat snails and slugs. So provide a shelter for them. Give them a place to live. They like a dark, moist area where they hide out during the day, and then they come out at night when it's cooler. You can use a fancy shelter like this, or simply pile up a few rocks. When you do that in your garden, very often you'll find a toad lives in there. Ground beetles are also a good predator for slugs. But for you to have ground beetles live in your garden, you have to provide a habitat. They live in the soil, but they like to live underneath material such as dead leaves or sticks, or even the mulch. Some people suggest that wood chips as a mulch is not good for your garden because it encourages slugs and snails to live. And that's probably true. They like to live in an area that's moist and dark. And so during the day they can crawl underneath that wood mulch and they have a good place to live. But that's where ground beetles live too. In my experience, I actually have less slug problems when I use wood chip mulch. If you want to control your slugs naturally, stop cleaning your garden so much. When you deadhead, take that flower and just throw it behind something. Let it sit on the ground and rot. That will attract your slugs and keep them off your good plant. Don't pick up every dead leaf that you see. The more natural you can keep your garden, the more likely it is that predators come along and take care of the slug problem for you. I've created some other videos about controlling pests in the garden, and I'll put a link to that playlist in the top right-hand corner. I encourage everyone to garden in a more natural way. Let nature take care of these pests for you. Happy gardening.